I'm going to talk a little bit about the period between, not a long span, but between 1608 and 1758. And I'm going to focus on the Native American influence on this area, particularly the history of Hampshire County. And everything that I'm going to talk about in that span of time is going to relate back to Hampshire County in some way, shape, or form. I'm also going to focus on a Native American chief. He was actually a shaman by the name of John Killbuck, or Bemino, which is what his Native American name was. And I'm going to focus on him because he becomes probably one of the Virginia regiment's biggest worries and nightmares during the beginning and middle part of the French and Indian War. He basically had free range up and down the South Branch Valley, so there wasn't a whole lot the Virginia regiment could do about it. So first I want to start, everyone recognize where that is? Indian Mound. So by everything we know, most of you all probably know this, that is a Hopewellian Adena culture mound of the mound builder period. Could be anywhere from 1000 BC, about the time of Rome, until the early 1st or 2nd century, possibly. This is not the only mound that is actually in the area. There are some others. There are also other known burials. The Adena buried a majority of their people above ground in stone enclosures. And there are several in the South Branch Valley, including all the way to Green Spring, where we find these people being buried. And artifacts on all of the river bottoms from upper Potomac all the way down to the mouth of the South Branch. So they were very, very predominant culture. I have a very early culture. If you've been out to Moundsville, you may have seen some of these things. They were very involved in their ability to use natural resources, particularly mica. If you find a rock pile, it looks like it's an old barrel, and you see pieces of mica in it, you should really kind of take a breath there, because you're more than likely in an Adena burial site. And you wouldn't even know it, because after all these years, that stone pile may be completely knocked down on purpose. But if you find mica, which is very odd to be in this area, it's probably because of that. And they were using it as jewelry. They would actually lay it in the wood. This is the general archaeological pattern or footprint of the primary Adena culture, mound builder culture. As you see, we're way over here, so their influence was much wider than the primary study area. This is the Adena mound builders. This is actually the Hopewellian culture, which did come this far east. Just to give you another idea of the craft, most folks know that the Native Americans like tobacco. This is actually an effigy pipe. And also, if you happen to run into an artifact that is of that nature, here's the hole where they would smoke from, and then there would be a pipe or a stem that comes out of it, and the tobacco would go in the top there. There are several known effigy pipes in Hampshire County in various collections. But again, this is a 1000 BC culture in this valley creating material uses at that level. We had Native American presence.
Can you speak up, because the motor just came on in the
Sure.
in the corner.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The point there is that Native American culture has been in this area for probably much longer than 1000 BC, obviously. It's really hard to say. I watched a video the other night on the eastern seaboard there, and they were tracking the southernmost extent of the glaciers and predicting how far off the current shoreline was dry land at that time, when the ice field sheet had come all the way down into the lower Pennsylvanians, and it was 70 miles off the coastline there. So there was cultures that are underwater that we don't even know about. They were here in Hampshire County for quite a while. This is an idea of what their villages look like through some archaeology. That style of house or enclosure really didn't change much. You're going to see that same kind of thing when I show you some Susquehannock pictures. Basically, their branches or slim trees bent up over the top and bark, baby skins.
Millie, do you want a chair? Do you want a stool?
Oh, I'm okay.
You sure?
Yeah, I'm really okay. But also,
I wish that this picture was bigger.
Might be a little more work, even though you have to sit beside
This one's actually referred to as an Algonquin village, but it is so typical of the type of village at about probably the late 1500s into all the way through the 1600s, up until probably the beginning of the Revolutionary War. If you walk into an Indian village, they were bark huts, but they were palisaded because there was an awful lot of war amongst other tribes as well as Europeans during that period of time, and they were fortified, just like we were building walls around our French and Indian forts at the same time. It did have an aspect to keep some of the livestock or wild animals in or out, but for the most part they started to palisade these villages in and of their own reason because of conflict with other tribes, and that's what's going on here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Susquehanna village that was found on a farm up the river here a little ways, and the village that of that group, they were Susquehannocks, was a circular law just like that one. And when I get to that one, I'll go into a little bit more detail, but to give you a timestamp on that village, it was there between 1550 to 1625 is the date they have on that village. And I'll talk more about that.
The one that was found up the river.
On south.
Yeah.
The village was actually of a Susquehannock tribe that had come out of Pennsylvania. More than likely pushed out of Pennsylvania by the Iroquois because there were no European settlers in the valley at the time that they occupied the South Branch Valley. The site up underneath Breakneck there was not the first village in this area that was Susquehannock. There was one down on the Harriet Farm, and there was one further south towards Moorfield. So there were a number of tribes here. This happens to be a picture of the meeting of Captain John Smith, and these look like Lenape. It very well could be a Susquehannock, but the really important aspect of John Smith being in this picture is that when he came up to Chesapeake Bay in 1608, he went on up the Susquehanna River and actually stayed almost 2 weeks with the Susquehanna tribe there. And he drew pictures and wrote what we realize today or acknowledge today is one of the best physical description of the Susquehanna Native American warrior that we've ever seen. And since they were living in the South Branch Valley, I wanted to take a little bit of time and look at that. Now, some of you all may have seen this image before. That's actually a drawing that John Smith made of a Susquehannock Indian. And I'm sure the folks in the back can't see, but you can come up after the meeting and take a look at it. These people were important. So this is obviously a long bow. This is a war club that has probably some type of aggregate ball on the top of it, maybe a spike. This is some piece of woven fabric or possibly a metal of some kind. But I would say that it's probably rope with probably what looks like a tanned fox head or something. And then a fox, what looks like a fox skin quiver. They'll like me talking about it. His hair is done in a style that we might see, that might be referred to as a mohawk, but that's a Susquehanna. So we're really blessed to have this image as well as a written description of the Susquehannock people. And it's because we're trying to visualize what it might be like in the day to go up the South Branch and run into a Susquehanna Indian. Well, that's what they would look like if that keeps you up at night. All right, now we're moving quickly through time. Before we get to talk to about then Colonel Washington. I wanted to make before we go into the French and Indian War period, I wanted to make a statement. So, before the European migration into the South Branch Valley, or really on the East Coast, the politics and the organization of tribes, their economy, what they use for currency, their language, their treaties, were all very geopolitical. And I tend to think of myself as a geopolitical historian, and I try to not get too far in the weeds on the French and Indian War battle, because it wasn't just the colonial Virginians fighting the Delaware or the Iroquois. It was all of those tribes that had already made up their mind that they didn't want the European settlers coming into the area, and had been dealing with it for years. It just came to a crescendo and became really probably the first truly world war on this continent, obviously, which I'll talk about a little bit. George Washington, here in his Virginia Regiment uniform outfit, spent a lot of time in Winchester and in this area, but way before he was a regimental officer in the Virginia Regiment. He was up here as an 18-year-old surveying with William Fairfax. He had just recently come from Ferry Farm and moved into Mount Vernon. His father had passed away, and he started surveying, and he was a very good surveyor. He thought like that. And in 1748, it was the springtime. The river was high. He was going to go, he came all the way up and went up the mountain towards Berkeley Spring. Instead of being down in the hollow there on 522, there's a road called Pack Horse Road that he traveled on. And he was planning to go across the river there in Hancock, but there was a big flood, so he couldn't go. He waited a week, and his group was able to get on up the river, and they stopped for the night at the mouth of the South Branch at Green Spring, there at Cressum's, Colonel Cressum's house. Of course, he didn't live there at the time. This is 1748. And while his survey crew was camped out there around the fire, there was a war party that came from the south, following the South Branch River, and spent the night with them there. And he got to spend the night there with them, and I'm not sure whether Cressum was there or not, but he had some other people there that were advising them on what they were doing, because they were civilian survey outfit, but there was military there. So anyway, he got to watch a war dance. And as they came into the village, he noticed that they were carrying scalps on the end of their battle axes. So I want to read to you his description. All right, so this is him, George Washington, at the age of 18, down at the mouth of the South Branch, describing this Native American war dance. They clear a large circle and make great fire in ye middle. The lights go out. You know, that might be me. They dance after they finish. Best dancers jump up as one awakened out of sleep, and runs and jumps about ye ring in a most comical manner. He is followed by ye rest, then begins there. Musicians who play ye music in a pot half full of water, with a deer skin stretched over it as tight as it can, and a gourd with some shot in it to rattle, and a piece of horse tail tied to it to make it look fine. So one keeps rattling and the other drumming, all the while others is dancing. And then he goes to the next day. So I make a point of this to let you know a little bit about what I'm sure a lot of us know is that George Washington was a very important man. He ended up being probably the American, certainly during that period of time, or Virginian. But he paid attention to things. He had an attitude, even though these were warriors, that there was something that he could learn from them. And he was very good at that. He really rarely would walk into the room and act like the smartest guy in the room, even when he was in Congress. He was the same way. He would sit and listen and pay attention. But his attention to the Native American culture and what they were doing and what they knew and what they didn't know is really what made him successful as a leader during the French and Indian War. And as a result, he survived at least 3 different close attacks on his life, including the battle at Montague, where he was shot through his coat many times and 2 horses. He was also very lucky. But he uses that knowledge that he gains from the Native Americans that he learned here in Hampshire County and other places, obviously, to an advantage in his career. And this story about the Native Americans in this area, Colonel Washington, is all about those 2 people trying to understand themselves. So I'm going to go into, real quick, I'm making sure I'm not getting over time.
I have a quick question for you. Why do you think that the War Party didn't attack the survey group?
Probably knew who was going to be there, probably knew Colonel Crescent, and they were the right people. Yeah, there was. He doesn't go into that. They were obviously friendly, and so they're probably Delaware and Shawnee. At that point, things really hadn't lined up. Iroquois with the British and Delaware and Shawnee with the French, but it was getting close to that. In fact, we go through a period where they'll meet with. I'm going to go through that. They'll meet with the folks in Winchester and the Treaty of Lancaster, and then they haven't made up their mind that they're going to go with the French until later, and then. We can talk a little bit about that. All right, so how many people have heard about the Treaty of Lancaster? 1744, Treaty of Lancaster. So this is where the Native Americans get together and try to make a deal with the British, and it actually is successful. They basically were provided land or agreed to provide land, but this is only the Iroquois. Remember, this is not the Delaware and Shawnee. This is the Iroquois doing a deal with the British, and they were already in good standing with each other, so it's not surprising that this one worked. So they gave enough land to the British that the English settlement in this area could occur. This was still a fought-over piece of ground between the Native Americans and Lord Fairfax's manor, up until the Treaty of Lancaster in 1744. And in exchange for that, the British government agreed not to join with France and get into the Indian War up north as a combined force of the British and the French. So it was a pretty good deal for both. One of the interesting aspects of that, let me make sure I get this name right. There's an Onondaga chief, Canasatego, name ring a bell? I don't know if you remember when the Constitution was, the Bill of Rights Constitution for the country was being put together. Ben Franklin went up on the floor of Congress and used a bundle of 13 arrows as an example of how the government should be formed. And he took one arrow and broke it. It took 13 arrows and he couldn't break it. Well, that came from this meeting. This chief was one of the leaders. I'm trying to get his name right. Canas, C-A-N-A-S-S-A-T-E-G-O. He was an Onondaga, which is an Iroquois derivative. He actually was apparently literate enough that he wrote an article, and the article was published, and Franklin found it and remembered it when he was in Congress and used that analogy, his recommendation that you should join in a confederacy like the Native Americans have, like the Iroquois Nation did. And so Franklin used that. Franklin was, again, like Washington, he embraced the area that they were trying to become a part of and learned a lot from them to the point where Franklin is using their logic for forming government. He must have had, but if Franklin was impressed, it was probably pretty good. Okay, so now we're going to jump a little bit more forward, getting back immediately to this area. 1748, Pearsall's Flat is somewhere here, but there's also a huge flood in 1748. I'll take a minute to give a kudos to Bill Rice. I'm sure a lot of you all know Bill. He related to the Stumps, really good friend of a lot of families in the valley, and he spent years in the basement of the courthouse writing a 6-volume set of capturing the intent and images of some of the documents that were found in the early phases of Hampshire County. And these 6 books are by far, in my opinion, the best collection of early records for Hampshire County in this area that I can even imagine, not that might exist, but that I can imagine, because he indexed them so well. And he tied some of the major elements together with actually reference to primary resource that it would have taken you your whole life to do. Unfortunately, they're for sale. I think, Dan, you have them at Pearsall Press. Yeah. And then also, it's even better. Dan has spent quite a while actually combining, all the indexes are 6 different volumes. Dan has put together an index of all 6 volumes and merged them together. What a resource. So if you want to get into really getting into the weeds on this, I can't think of a better resource. You can go ahead and read Maxwell Swisher and The History of the Valley. All those books are great. These are primary court documents. So, all right. So we're going to jump forward now to 1753. George Washington and the Half King. I have a picture of him here somewhere. Leave. Washington is an officer in the Virginia regiment. He's not lieutenant colonel yet, but he's pointed out by Dinwiddie to go and get with his friend Christopher Gist, who was a trader and scout, and go up to Fort LeBeouf, which is up above Pittsburgh on one of the runs that comes into the Ohio, and tell them that they have intentions of building a fort at Pittsburgh and that they are in British territory. But they handed a letter from Dinwiddie to the officer there, and of course at that time he had Washington and Gist had 8 or 10 Shawnee with him, and again they weren't alive yet. I mean they hadn't really picked sides, and both of the Shawnee leaders that he had with him abandoned Washington after they found out the response that he got from the French. So he and Gist had to come back, and long story short, Washington falls off the raft trying to cross the Monongalia River in freezing cold weather and almost died in that, and that's one of the 3 that he survived. Christopher Gist goes on to be one of Washington's go-to guys. He was, every time that he was in the Northwest, he had Christopher Gist with him. He was almost a member of his family. Another good book to read if you're interested in Washington's life would be on Christopher Gist. So now we come to the Treaty of Winchester, and this one's even, in my opinion, more important than the Treaty of 1744, but it has directly to do, again, with Hampshire County. So these are, again, a Delaware and Shawnee chiefs meeting in Winchester, and the Delaware chief was actually Twice. You all may have heard of him. And they were appealing the idea of the British fort at the Forks. And they explained that they don't want any building. The Native Americans don't want the French or the British to build anything there. They want it to stay the way it is. They couldn't get, no one was conceding to that. So what they did concede to is if you do build something there, it should be a strong house. which should be used for trade, not as a military repose. So anyway, that was the agreement of that, and sure enough, of course, Gist and Washington have come back. They've told Dinwiddie that the French aren't having any of it, and they really don't know exactly how that's all going to play out. At that point, on March 15, 1754, Dinwiddie commissions George Washington as Lieutenant Colonel, Virginia Regiment. And here it begins, and sends him, quote, to build a fort at the Forks. This is in 54. April 17th, 54, French above the Forks of Ohio. So they've already moved in before Washington even got there. The French moved in to the site where they were going to build the fort. But Washington is on his way. He doesn't know whether he's going to have to fight him or what the deal is. So in May 1 of 1754, we're moving kind of fast here. Hampshire County is formed. They don't really do a whole lot about it. They just say Hampshire County exists and don't even know where it is yet. And everything is so in turmoil, they're not going to go out and try to make people settle in the ground. They have to get some other things done. But it is on record in May 1st of 54 that Hampshire County was formed, and it was included over 2,000 square miles of property from the Fairfax line all the way to the Potomac River and all the way to the current line of Virginia, more or less. Of course, once the Fairfax line hits the headwaters of, I believe, the Rappahannock there, and then you're back in classic Virginia there. So, two things going on there with the Native Americans. They didn't want the fort there. They wished that people would listen to them. This battle and war may or may not have happened. They'd rather just lived in peace and traded with the English and fought amongst themselves like they had for the last 5,000 or 6,000 years. But that didn't work. So on May 30th, 1754, the Shawnee ambushed a French liaison contingent, including Jumonville, the brother of one of the major adjutants in the British or the French forces, and kills him. Actually, he was killed by an Indian. And that is what a lot of people have referred to in history as a shot heard around the world. And at that point, there was no turning back. We were in a world war. French and British had already been, for the most part, fighting each other. But what's interesting is the lines were drawn. Now the Iroquois were completely aligned with the British, and the Shawnee and the Delaware were no longer mincing words. They were going with the French, and the war was on. Washington, as a newly lieutenant colonel, retreats and is defeated at Great Meadow up near Summersville in a rainstorm, and the French contingent actually sits down with him in their little building inside this circular fort in the low spot that was full of water, and he signed a confession. You all probably heard about that, where he actually, it was written in French, and he had one of Washington's guys interpreting for him, and it basically says, I agree that Jumonville was assassinated by my troops, and he didn't realize that he was signing that. So that, of course, went back to France. And the war, if the war wasn't going before, it's going now, because Jumonville was an elite aristocracy, and he was there to parlay, so to speak. So that's an unfortunate characteristic. But again, what I'm doing here is I'm trying to show you the interrelationship and the cause and effect. It wasn't just the French against the British. It was truly a French and Indian American settlement war. Everybody was involved. It was a geopolitical nightmare, and there was multiple continents involved, and it hadn't got as big as it's going to get yet. It's going to get bigger.
You're in the middle.
Yeah. And the impact on this area was just detrimental, so we'll talk about that here in just a minute. All right, so there was a big lull from July, middle of the year 54, and there was things going on. There was attacks going on in the area, but they were kind of hit and run. The next thing you hear about is Braddock. General Braddock is coming with the largest military force to ever be launched on the North American continent. And he took a long time supplying his troops, and they built the wagon road out of Fort Cumberland. I haven't mentioned Fort Cumberland yet. It's a very substantial fort in this story. It was the headquarters and wagon wheels, all the troop motions coming and going into the northwest. And from there, that was their base camp. From there, they built basically quarter war roads over a period of 6 or 8 months to get their cannons to be able to dislodge the French from whatever fort they built there at Forks. Well, you all know this story. They were ambushed perfectly by a French and Native American contingent at the crossing of the Monongalia, and soundly defeated. Washington was lucky that he didn't get shot. I have no idea what the casualty count was. They did kill, Braddock was killed in that fight, and they buried him in the road up there. So at this point, you would think that that's the high tide of the war. They've defeated the British Army, the French are going to go back and have fun with their fort, and everything is good. Well, that's not what happens. Everybody here at this point, I might mention that there is people moving into the valley from the date of the 1744 Lancaster Treaty. The population in this area went up drastically. A lot of the early settlers who ended up getting patents from Lord Fairfax were here, if not earlier, like Joseph Edwards at Edwards Fort down in Cable Bridge. He was here at least as early as 1738. That was further east. That wasn't Fairfax's manor. Fairfax's manor ran up and down, most of it up and down the South Branch. So once those pieces of ground became available for lease and patent, the movement was on, and it started happening immediately. It'd be interesting to actually outline the dates those patents were actually accomplished and how fast, what time period they were actually secured. All right, so.
Do you want that light on? Would you like that light on? Up top?
That would help. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about Killbuck. And it's really important as you get a feel for who John Killbuck was. First of all, he survives the war. He's alive not only after the French and Indian War, but he survives the Revolutionary War. His father was a shaman at Wahis, and his son Bemino, the Killbuck that we talk about as the warrior, was also a shaman. And then he had a son, Leleman, who actually ends up being an American patriot. He was buried with honors up in Ohio. He fought in the Revolution for the Americans. Now, some of that decision has to do with the Delaware and the Shawnee actually literally hated the Iroquois. So they didn't care who the European partner was. They weren't going to make friends with the Iroquois. So that's part of it. And it explains why a lot of the Shawnee Delaware actually helped up with the Americans in the war against Britain, because the Iroquois were supporting Britain. And that's an interesting dynamic, because most of the attacks in these valleys, when the Revolutionary got into its upswing, stopped. And we were all pretty much in the same thought process at that point. But let me talk about Killbuck just a little bit more. So remember I was telling you about Washington understanding wanting to understand how people think. Killbuck was the same way, but he was a Native American. He was or First People, however you want to refer to it. Their influences were for thousands of years living tribally in these mountains, in these areas, and making the best resources available that they could make, and understanding the natural reaction and concepts when you actually go to attack somebody physically. So when he would set up an attack, and Killbuck has been given credit for 7 or 8 classic attacks, and as far as we know, he was only defeated one time, and it was the first attack that he made was against Jedediah Smith up in the upper part, beyond the upper tract. And the only reason that we believe that he actually left that battle is because either the wind wasn't right, or his men were in the wrong position, and he knew he was going to lose more than he already did, so he just retreated. He didn't keep going. He didn't have an officer telling him, if you don't go, you'll be shot. He just decided that doesn't make any sense, and we're not doing it. And that's the thing that Washington learned. And he was fortunate during the French and Indian War that he had Daniel Morgan working with him, because Morgan was the same way. Morgan ends up being the head of the Virginia Riflemen. He was basically the Ranger Rifle Company commander for Washington, and it's getting close to winning cowpens, which really turns the war. That's another story. The point is they learned Native American tactics, they thought like that, they wouldn't put their men, they didn't have very many men, they wouldn't put their men in a position that would cause an obvious death toll. They were smarter than that. Washington exhibits that. I'm getting out of sequence here, but during the Revolutionary War, Washington was a master of that. He had literally 4 times his men in front of him at Boston, and he still survived. Same thing in New York, and he did it time and time again. It wasn't British tactics. It was a combination of just common sense and what he had learned from the Native Americans really tearing him up here during the French and Indian War. And I'm going to show you why that thought process works. One of the most interesting battles to me is it's called the Battle of the Trough. Does everybody know where the trough is? Okay, so it happened on the south end of the trough, on the east side of the river. And I have a picture of it, but I'm going to kind of explain this to you and you can visualize. Just envision yourself standing in the field there, Bob. You've got the river on the left. You're looking at the railroad trestle coming across. And the river's to your left, and then you've got 2 points coming down at you, right in, looking north towards Romney, coming right at you. It's a hollow that goes up. If you climb to the top of this ridge and drop off, you fall right in the river. It's a steep ledge. On this side, it's a very gentle roll, but it's another ridge that's very dominant. And just as you leave the field, cross the railroad track and go up in there about 50 yards to your right, there's a huge canyon cut through that ridge to your right. Like driving up the Trough Road, and after you get past the Trough General Store, and you go through that big cut right there, well, that's what it looked like. So he is up in the drainage of the South Branch, and he's made his mind up that he's going to attack not Fort Pleasant. He's going to attack Fort Hopewell, which was there, what was then called Haywardstown, which is in between Oldfields and Moorfield. Moorfield didn't exist at that point. It was called Haywardstown. And they had a Fort Hopewell there that was a settler's fort. It was not really even a militia fort, but they were militia there. No Virginia regiment officers there. And he chose to attack that for one reason. Again, it had rained and the river was up. And guess who's on the other side of the swollen river? The Virginia regiment. So it gets serious. So he captures, he attacks a couple of homesteads up there, and he kidnaps 2 women, Mrs. Neff and Mrs. Brake. Mrs. Brake has a child. We're not sure whether it was her grandchild or her child. She's older, not being able to get along very well, and she doesn't make it, so to speak. So he ends up with Mrs. Neff, and they head on down to Moorfield. And by this time, I need to mention that Killbuck had probably 50 or 60 warriors with him. And the reason some people forget that, they know certain numbers, but nobody ever really sees these 50 or 60 warriors. They know they're there when the battle starts and goes, but nobody sees them moving anywhere. That's how good they are. They never rode horses. They'd steal them, but they wouldn't ride them. And so here they come down the valley. It's nighttime. He decides to let 3 of his Native Americans go with the women and present themselves in front of the settler fort. And they actually lay down and go to sleep before they didn't come out or whatever. And she gets up, and they did this intentionally, and runs to the fort. and of course they allowed that to happen. And she tells them the story about Mrs. Brake and stuff that had gone on. And so the first thing the next morning, they send out a group. There was a trained Indian fighter there, his name, and they went out looking for sign to see if they could determine just how many Native Americans were. They knew the Indians were there, they just didn't know how many. And so they were backtracking on this trail, and they determined that it was only 4 or 5 people. And so we're going. So 16 or 18 of them mounted up, and they looked down the valley that I was explaining before. And up in that hollow between those 2 ridges, this one goes steep to the river, and this one goes up this way. There's smoke in the hollow, but it's not where it normally is. And the interesting thing, down at the bottom of that valley, there's a spring there, and that's where the Indians always camp. They're not camping, they're camped up in the hollow. That should have been the first clip. But so they ride down, and they don't jump anybody. They think they're all at their camp. They're going to put the sneak on them. They're riding horses. The colonials are riding horses. And so they go up in that hollow, and instead of going up the draw, they actually take the ridge up. They think they're far enough up there that they're going to ride straight to the top of the ridge, tie their horses up, sneak down over the backside, go up, and then come over the top and push the Indians into the river. But what they don't know is those 50, 60 warriors are down hidden underneath the ridge towards the river in that ledge. And as soon as they commit themselves to go up the top of the ridge, they're up there letting go their horses, they come around and go up that canyon. Go all the way up into the next hollow, get in behind them, and just as they start to battle, they come in behind them and push them all into the river. And 7 of them were killed. They steal all their horses. And Killbuck didn't lose a man. So what's interesting is I'm going to talk about Fort Edwards now. And we're very uncertain about the difference between the Trough Battle and the Fort Edwards Battle. We know that the Fort Edwards Battle was April 18th, Easter Day, at about 6 p.m. And the river was up because Fremont, the officer of that fort, was supposed to take his 30 of his men and actually go to support Fort Enoch, which was at right there at the Fort Cable. He couldn't get across the river, so, and that's in his notes. So we know the river was high, and it was high when they did the Trough Battle because that kept the Virginia Regiment from coming to the militia's rescue. So it had to have been within days. Those two fights were within days. On his way to Edwards, he went around Romney somehow towards Fort Ashby, got into a fight there, killed a couple wagoneers there and 2 Virginia Regiment guys, turned and went towards, at this point he's got French with him, and they go down the Coldstream Road saying that they're still on the right side of the river. Fremont has turned around and gone back to the fort because he had to go across the river to get to Enoch, so his mission was stopped because the river was up. So everybody's on the same side of the river. Here comes Killbuck with his whole force, and he stops. The regiment goes back to the fort. They capture two guys that are in the area, kill them, and they let one go, do the same thing. One of the, it must have been 3 guys. One of them gets back to the fort and tells Fremont the Native Americans just killed some people, and here's where they are. So he comes out of the fort with 30 guys. He's got 40 or 50 there. We're not really sure how many he has. Daniel Morgan's actually in the fort, but he was wounded on his trying to get to Fort Ashby back to Edwards. He was attacked by this same group and was shot through the throat, and he survives. But he's in Fort Edwards recovering, so he couldn't fight. So I don't know if, again, if you're not familiar with that area, the battle occurred on the Fort Edwards Run wildlife management area. So if you go down Coldstream Road, turn left right as soon as you get in Cable Bridge, go past the Christian Church on Coldstream Road. You go about 1.5 miles and it's on the left. Well, there's a mill pond there. By that time there was already a mill there. The Edwards had already built a mill. There's a mill pond there, and it had a dam. And then from there, the Edwards Run goes on through that mill dam and then continues at a creek. But the creek was a large bank. So they, 16, this first group that crossed the dam first, in formation, go across, and as soon as they get clear across, the Native Americans jump up from the bank below, and they now have an Indian force both in their front. They don't realize it yet, but now in their back. And so they jump up, and they don't shoot. They just go into them with tomahawks. And then when they stop, and they're wondering what's going on, and by that time they didn't even know they had a force in front of them. The whole hillside cut loose, and they killed Mercer, Captain Mercer, and 16 other men in that fight. One of the worst massacres that Washington ever had with a full-blown Virginia regiment contingent. Mercer was the brother of George Mercer from down at Leesburg, colonial legislator, and so that a lot of people call that the high tide of the French and Indian War in this area. But the attacks didn't stop, mainly because once they heard that the Native Americans had killed the officer of a Virginia Regiment 4 and 16 of their men, immediately the Shenandoah Valley starts to clear. Everybody's going back into the Potomac. All the aristocracy leaves, so it's not just South Branch Valley. It's 1756, and everybody's leaving, even Winchester. So that's referred to as the high tide. Again, Killbuck's tactics against the regiment there taught them a deadly lesson But again, Washington observes and sees, and he knows. And in fact, the unfortunate thing about that is one of the, it's not the only time it ever happened, but it was so egregious. There was some failure to respond. There was 3 court-martials. And we're fortunate that we know so much about that battle because it was a long, extended court battle in these court-martials that brought out every detail. They interviewed, if you're a military historian, it's really cool because they interviewed every officer. They put it together. So again, now Washington has really got his hands full, and he now implements his famous chain of forts, which basically changes the economy in wartime because he's actually now establishing 14 different forts within an area that's evacuating, and the whole purpose is to keep the settlers there so they don't lose their whole economy, or they want to try to keep the people there, and it works for a while. You can imagine it went both ways. Romney, that's a good point, a good time to talk about Romney. The biggest hub in that chain of forts for about 4 years was Fort Pearsall. It was the largest military depot in this area with the exception of Fort Loudon and Winchester. So there was a lot of commerce going there, a lot of people moving through here. It was good for Romney. I mean, Romney didn't completely evacuate. They felt secure, and in fact, there was no attack here in this immediate area. Pearsall was so well positioned that it was never attacked, so it was a safe area. Although every home would not go into the fields without their weapon. So they were actually farming with their guns or didn't go at all. It didn't really matter.
I'm sorry, Dave. We don't actually know the site of Fort Pearsall. I mean, nobody's been able to determine.
Yeah, there's some awful good guesses, but we need some archaeology. It's big. I mean, once we get a piece of it, it'll go pretty fast.
Yeah.
So, I know I'm way over my time frame already. Well, actually, I got just a couple more minutes. So, I think it's important, or at least it is for me to understand, this whole story of the French and Indian War is a character study of not only George Washington, but the Native Americans who were here as well. I have the greatest respect for both sides of the conflict. I think there's some European aspect in the run-in with the Native Americans that was happening all up and down the eastern seaboard with various fashions and various reasons. But they have to be given, the Native American force has to be given credit, because honestly, if I was them, I can't think of, except for a few very brazen harm that they did, I wouldn't argue with their position at all. And it truly, it was not only a world war for the people who were coming to the American continent and trying to settle here. It caused exaggerated conflict between tribes and native people. It'd be like West Virginia fighting Maryland, or Maryland fighting Ohio, because we sided with another invader. But it was at that level of Native American and British and French. They're all different cultures, but French and the British walked into a economy and civilization and organization that was very well established. They just didn't speak English, and they were Native American. And so that's, and I want to leave you with this. We talk about Hampshire County. We not only are the oldest town in West Virginia, but we trained the first president of the United States how to serve and fight. And the men that and the ideas that he got from that, and the knowledge that he gained, and the relationships with the people that would go on to help him during the Revolutionary War came from this episode. Morgan, 3 or 4 of his other officers were with him, either here or between here and Fort Duquesne in those operations. He had a chance to show who he was. They respected him, and I'm not surprised at all that he ends up being the president of the country, because that's just the type of guy he was. But he had help from the Native Americans. They taught him several very good lessons. So, I'll be glad to answer any questions.
I have 2 questions. The first question is, after the high tide that we talked about, and you said the settlers were leaving the area from Shenandoah Valley, from Winchester, when did they start to return back to the area, and what brought them back?
That's another good point. So, this talk kind of stops at 1758, but it went on for another 4 years. There was a man, officer, Virginia regiment officer, killed there at Fort John Kirkendall, where John Kelly Dixon was, in 62. And that was pretty much the end of it. So it was still, the war wasn't over, it lingered on. I forgot to mention, the big crescendo that really turned the tide in England's favor was the John Forbes campaign in 58. So he got into a big fight and he had a good many casualties, but at that point the French were done and we occupied the forts and it became a major hub for British expansion. So to answer your question, I would say after 1762, and you see a lot of people coming out of Pennsylvania as early as the late 50s, early 60s. My family was in Lancaster, and they all end up in Horry County now, in late 1750s, early 1760s. So they must have felt pretty good about it.
And the second question that I had was when you were talking about the attack on the forts and how the English would, I mean, it seems like the Indian population was pretty strategic in how they advanced their plans, basically, which was cool. But it's like, didn't the forts have the ability to communicate with each other? Because in two different incidents that you talk about, it's like the English gets flanked.
Yeah.
And you would think that that would be
That's another
something
great
that's
point,
shared.
Eileen. So letters and couriers is the only way they can communicate. And again, we're very fortunate that that's actually how it occurred, because we have a treasure trove of letters written from Washington and Wagner and all the commanders of the forts. Some of them are missing. The one that John McNeil wrote to Dinwiddie that explains the Battle of Tract is missing. We know it existed, but nobody can find it. And there were good times. There was a contingent out of Fort Greenbrier that had been over towards the Ohio River. It was before the Cornstalk episode, and they captured 2 buffalo somehow or another. They brought them all the way back and shipped them down to Dinwiddie. Dinwiddie had 2 buffalo in the yard there at the big governor's ranch. So those were good times. But our economy came right back. I mean, this is some of those fertile ground in the country. We had, this full mill seats. It's no surprise to me that Fairfax chose this ground for its manor, because it's the headwaters of 3 of the biggest streams in the northern continent. And so you had all the water power. The land was extremely fertile. It was going to be right adjacent to the native population, and the mill capacity in this county in the late 1700s phenomenal.